And one thing that is very important to emphasize is this also is something that can be done to strings, or excuse me, to lists. So if I try to take, this is the same list that we started with in the first segment. And if I want to, I can actually, one thing I'll also go and demonstrate while I'm doing this is if you just do print my list without any brackets, much like a string, that'll just print out the entire list. Now, something that's very important to emphasize here is if you try to do my list plus another list, it's actually not going to add each individual component to each other. This is actually going to concatenate my list to itself, much like I did with the strings here. So instead of taking the 3 and adding it to another 3 that appears in the same position, it's actually just going to join these two lists together to form a list that's twice as long. And to demonstrate that, you can see this was the result of one list that we started with, and if we take that list and join it to itself, we get this result. But the main thing I really want to emphasize with this demonstration is that you cannot, when you're working with Python lists, you cannot add one list to the other to get something, maybe to actually get something mathematical. It's actually just going to join the two lists together to form a longer list in the order that it appears. And you also cannot use the subtraction operator because that is just, you can't use a subtraction operator to do any sort of concatenation. It doesn't make much sense to subtract one string from the other, and it also doesn't make much sense to subtract a list of any sort of item from another. Even though all we have here is numbers, it might be tempting to try and use a subtraction operator, but you actually can't do that when you're working with a Python list. Later on, we'll look at a similar idea, a data type that's similar to lists, but for now, when you're working with Python lists, you can't use this to do any sort of math between the two lists, even though they might have numbers in them. This does not work. And another thing that I'll go ahead and emphasize, and this kind of ties back to what we were looking at in the previous segment with the loops. So in one of the demonstrations, we had a setup where we were taking each individual item in a list, multiplying it by 2 to basically get an end result that is each item in the list multiplied by 2. You cannot achieve the same end result by doing this. This, like the multiplication for a string, is just going to take this list and concatenate it to itself however many number of times here. So you cannot take this 2 and simply distribute it to each item in the list here by doing something like this. If you want to do any sort of math with entries that appear in a list, you have to pull out each individual item in the list one by one, perform your math on each item in the list, and then print out the result or do whatever with it. So probably the simplest thing would be to just print out the result if that's all you really care about. But main thing is you can't do something like this. It's just simply multiply each item in a list by 2. You have to, in fact, if you try this, you'll get an even better response. Can't multiply sequence of non-int by type float. So that's just really important takeaway message. You can't simply take a 2 and distribute it to every item in the list. And also you can't do something like this. If you try this on a string, whether this is a string or a list, you'll get the same error message. Basically the same basic error message. So also you can't do something like this. You can't subtract lists from strings. Try as you might, you'll just get error messages appearing on the console if you attempt something like that. Now, individual entries in the list, yeah, you can absolutely multiply those by 2, but you can't take the entire list and multiply it by 2. That won't work at all, or it won't do what you expect. It will work if you put an integer in there, but it won't really do something that it's probably going to do something that you don't really want. So just something very important to keep in mind when you're working with lists in Python. If you want to do any sort of math on a list, you have to do it each individual item. You have to pull each individual item out and then operate on each individual item in the list one at a time. And the best way to accomplish that in the most efficient means possible is to use a for loop, much like we demonstrated in the previous 2 segments. But that's going to do it for this segment on concatenation strings and how that also applies to lists. In the next segment, we're going to take a look at something called slicing. And so with that, I will see you all in the next segment.